Centuries ago, I heard stories that seemed impossible to believe. Whispers of a secret guarded by ancient priests, hidden from the world, of a law so powerful it could transform any base metal into gold. I didn't believe it, of course. Until, one silent night, sifting through forgotten manuscripts in a library that smelled of dust and centuries of silence, I found references that changed everything. Time-worn words, enigmatic symbols, coded instructions that seemed to dance before me, revealing fragments of something no one had dared to study for 2,000 years. What drove me on this quest wasn't greed, but curiosity. Something told me there was more than just the promise of wealth. There was a profound understanding of nature, the universe, and what we call value. Each scroll I read seemed to watch me, challenging me to decipher the hidden meaning behind the words. I felt each discovery connected to the previous one, as if an ancient intelligence were guiding my path, testing my attention, my patience, and my courage. And then I began to notice patterns, an invisible logic that spanned centuries, across empires and civilizations. Every culture that discovered gold had, in some way, fragments of this law. But, curiously, no one had ever managed to decipher its entirety. Why would anyone hide something so valuable? The answer seemed simple, and, at the same time, complex. True gold lies not only in physical wealth, but in the understanding of principles that shape destiny, fortune, and even time itself. I then decided to document my journey. Every step, every clue, every discovery would be recorded, not just for myself, but for those who dared to look beyond the surface of the material world. Because the hidden law of gold is not something learned overnight. It is a path that requires patience, attention, and the courage to face the unknown. And so began my investigation, delving into secrets that had been forgotten, hidden for centuries, waiting for someone capable of seeing beyond the metallic shine and realizing the true power that the law of gold had always held. My first clue came from a place no one would have expected: ancient trade maps. They weren't just geographical representations, but coded records of the gold routes that crossed continents and empires. Looking at them, I noticed patterns that seemed simple at first glance, but hid something deeper. There were almost imperceptible markings, symbols strategically repeated, as if someone had left a riddle to be deciphered only by those willing to understand. Every line, every curve, every red dot seemed to tell a story that transcended time. As I examined the maps, I began to notice the consistency of these signals in vastly different places. From ruins in Mesopotamia to forgotten temples in Egypt, there was an invisible thread connecting these civilizations. It was as if they had all accessed the same knowledge and then lost it, leaving only fragments behind. This realization made me question the nature of wealth itself. If gold were merely a single metal, why did it appear in such a coordinated fashion across such diverse cultures? The answer seemed to suggest that the true law of gold lay not in the physical object, but in how it was perceived, cultivated, and stored. My investigation then led me to study ancient rituals and records of mining and trade. I discovered that many of these cultures possessed techniques that, if observed closely, revealed mathematical patterns, a kind of secret geometry applied to the accumulation of wealth. It was striking to note how what seemed like superstition or mysticism had a silent logic, a methodology hidden behind veiled symbols and words. Each document, each engraving, seemed to whisper to me that there was more than simple metal, that there existed an order that connected knowledge, power, and prosperity. However, this initial discovery brought with it more questions than answers. If this golden rule was known and applied by so many, why did it disappear so completely? What if it had been intentionally hidden? By whom and for what purpose? I felt I was only scratching the surface, that each fragment of information was like a piece of a puzzle that was not yet fully formed. And even as my fascination grew, a sense of urgency consumed me. The longer it took me to understand, the more distant this secret would become from our time. That's how I realized the journey wouldn't just be an exploration of artifacts and documents, but a true dive into human understanding of value, power, and perhaps even ourselves. Each clue found was not only a revelation, but also an invitation to look beyond the obvious, to question what we consider wealth, and how the world has perceived it over millennia. As I delved deeper into my research, I realized it wasn't enough to simply follow maps or decipher ancient symbols. There was something more subtle, almost invisible, that needed to be understood: the patterns of human behavior surrounding gold. Each civilization seemed to have developed a unique relationship with it, as if the metal were not just a material good, but also a catalyst for intentions, ambitions, and even conflict. And the more I studied, the clearer it became that the hidden law was not only written in stone or papyrus, but also in people's actions and choices. Visiting forgotten archives and chronicles, I began to notice stories that repeated themselves in different times and places. Rulers who built empires overnight, merchants who accumulated fortunes almost by instinct, and at the same time, others who saw their wealth mysteriously disappear. There was something invisible governing this alternation between rise and fall, and it wasn't simply luck or bad luck. The occult law seemed to operate like a silent force, almost like an energy that rewarded those capable of understanding its principles and punished those who acted solely out of blind greed. And it was then that I began to see unexpected connections between science and mysticism. Many of the ancient civilizations I studied possessed advanced knowledge of geometry, astronomy, and even chemistry applied to gold. But this knowledge was shrouded in symbolism, rituals, and codes that only the initiated could interpret. I realized that gold, as a metal, was merely a physical reflection of something greater, a tangible manifestation of universal principles that, if understood, could reveal the path to true prosperity. Observing these patterns, I began applying my own method of analysis, cross-referencing information from different cultures and eras. And, little by little, a structure began to emerge before my eyes, an almost invisible system that connected learning, discipline, ethics, and worldview to what we call wealth. It was fascinating to realize that, behind every empire, every historical fortune, there were signs of this law, discreet but consistent, as if the universe were trying to teach something humanity had long forgotten. This realization completely changed my approach. It was no longer just a search for gold, maps, or symbols. It was an investigation into what makes someone capable of perceiving, interpreting, and applying invisible laws that shape destinies. And, as I grasped this deeper dimension, I began to understand that each clue I found was not just an archaeological or historical discovery, but also a mirror reflecting the human capacity to understand and connect with forces that transcend time. With each new discovery, I began to realize that gold was not merely an object of desire, but a symbol of invisible forces that govern the balance between power, wisdom, and destiny. Visiting forgotten temples and ruins covered by time, I found inscriptions that spoke of cycles of prosperity and the knowledge that shapes value. These words, at first glance, seemed poetic, but when analyzed in light of what I already knew, they revealed a surprisingly practical logic. Every civilization that prospered seemed to understand, even if intuitively, this hidden law, while those that indulged only in greed ended up losing everything. I was then led to study more deeply the ancient methods of storing and circulating gold. I discovered that it wasn't just about accumulating wealth, but about knowing how to move it, protect it, and, above all, use it in harmony with higher principles. There was a subtle pattern. Those who followed certain invisible rules maintained their prosperity, while those who ignored the signs were quickly consumed by their own greed. It was as if the law of gold operated almost like a living force, responding to human behavior, rewarding discipline, patience, and vision, and punishing impulsiveness or ignorance. Most fascinating, however, was realizing that these principles weren't restricted to gold or material wealth. They also appeared in forms of knowledge, influence, and even relationships. All of life seemed to reflect this same pattern of balance, as if the hidden law of gold were actually a universal metaphor, teaching that true prosperity can only exist when one understands the connection between value, action, and responsibility. I began to wonder, if someone could master this knowledge, they would be able to transform any aspect of life, not just their finances. As I followed these clues, I felt something I hadn't anticipated, a silent fear, almost as if history itself were watching me. Documents that had been intact for centuries seemed to want to disappear, and places that once welcomed me now showed signs of abandonment and secrecy. It was as if the law of gold didn't want to be easily unraveled. Perhaps because its power was dangerous if misunderstood. But at the same time, this resistance only strengthened my determination. Each obstacle made me realize that the secret was profound, requiring not only curiosity, but also courage and dedication to reach. And so, with each clue I found, my journey transformed. It was no longer just an archaeological or historical quest. It was a journey of understanding the invisible patterns that shape the world, an attempt to decipher the relationship between power, knowledge, and wealth. And I felt, more intensely with each step, that I was only beginning to scratch the surface of what this hidden law truly meant. As time passed, I realized that the fragments of knowledge I encountered were not just historical records, but pieces of a puzzle that required careful interpretation. Each document, each symbol, each ancient map seemed to speak to one another, creating a silent language that I was only beginning to understand. And the further I progressed, the more evident it became that this hidden law was more than a simple rule about wealth. It was a principle that connected cycles, human decisions, and the flow of time itself. In my research, I began to notice recurring patterns across cultures. Empires that seemed geographically isolated shared strikingly similar methods for accumulating and preserving gold. These patterns weren't limited to military or political strategies. There was something deeper, almost as if all these civilizations had accessed the same universal knowledge, though each had adapted it to their own reality. It was as if there existed a gold code, a set of invisible guidelines that determined who prospered and who succumbed. But there was something unsettling about this. Each clue also revealed gaps. Documents were incomplete, symbols seemed to have lost meanings, and essential instructions were often veiled by enigmatic metaphors. I began to realize that occult law was not meant to be easily understood. It required patience, observation, and the ability to perceive connections where others saw only coincidence. Each breakthrough in the investigation showed me that the real challenge was not finding gold, but understanding the minds and principles of those who had used it for millennia. As I reflected on this, I realized that the Golden Rule also manifested itself in seemingly trivial everyday decisions. Small choices, patterns of discipline, long-term vision, and the ability to interpret environmental cues all seemed part of an invisible system that rewarded those capable of perceiving the logic behind apparent chaos. It was fascinating to realize that ancient teachings weren't limited to material wealth, but taught a path to holistic prosperity, financial, intellectual, and even spiritual. And it was at this point that my perception completely changed. I wasn't just following clues or deciphering ancient symbols. I was learning to understand the universal principles that shaped entire civilizations. Each discovery brought me closer to the essence of the hidden law of gold. It wasn't the metal that possessed absolute value, but the ability to understand, interpret, and apply these principles that created true power. And the more I understood this, the clearer it became that the secret couldn't be handed down simply. It required deep understanding, dedication, and, above all, respect for the knowledge that spanned centuries. As I continued my research, I began to realize that the rule of thumb wasn't limited to ancient civilizations or coded maps and symbols. It also manifested itself in how people understood value, trust, and responsibility. Observing the social and economic structures of those times, I realized that wealth was carefully managed not only with material strategies, but with an almost intuitive sense of the balance between giving and receiving, between hoarding and sharing. This realization made me reflect on how we often overlook the subtle patterns that shape prosperity in our own lives. In some ruins I visited, I found records detailing ceremonies and rituals that, at first glance, seemed like mere superstition. However, analyzing them in light of previous discoveries, I noticed that every gesture, every offering, and every sequence of actions reflected a hidden logic. It was as if these rituals served to align human behavior with the invisible order that governed the flow of gold. Discipline, patience, and attention to detail values transmitted through these rituals were essential to understanding and applying the law that had been forgotten for 2,000 years. As I studied these practices, I also realized how knowledge about gold was transmitted only to those who demonstrated dedication and discernment. It wasn't just about teaching mining or storage techniques, but about shaping a mind capable of perceiving complex patterns and acting in harmony with them. It was fascinating to realize that, even with the passing of centuries, these principles remained relevant. They revealed that true wealth lies not simply in possessing gold, but in understanding the intelligence behind its creation and preservation. And then, I began to connect these concepts to modern life. I saw how successful companies, governments, and individuals apply, even unknowingly, the same patterns I observed in ancient civilizations. Resource management, strategic vision, and an understanding of the invisible forces that shape opportunities and risks were reflections of the hidden law of gold. Every detail, every decision, every careful step, no matter how small, could determine whether prosperity flourished or faded. I finally realized that my journey was not just an exploration of historical secrets, but a journey of self-discovery and understanding of the world. The law of gold is not just a mystery of the past. It is a living principle, waiting to be recognized and applied. And as I progressed, I felt that each discovery not only brought me closer to the secret hidden for millennia, but also taught me to see wealth not just as metal, but as wisdom, strategy, and insight. As I continued my investigation, I began to realize that there were even deeper layers hidden within what we call wealth. It wasn't just about physical gold or accumulated resources. It was about understanding the energy behind the creation and preservation of value. In ancient texts I had previously overlooked, I found references to a kind of harmony of flow, a concept that described how human actions, choices, and intentions could influence prosperity in invisible ways. It was fascinating to realize that this concept spanned cultures, continents, and millennia, ever present like an invisible thread connecting those who truly prospered. Exploring these ideas, I began to reflect on how knowledge about gold was protected. It wasn't just an economic or material secret. It was codified knowledge, almost like a universal language. Each ancient civilization that knew the law of gold had developed its own methods of transmission, but they all shared one thing in common. Only those who demonstrated understanding, patience, and integrity were able to access its complete wisdom. This made me realize that the law is not to be discovered with haste or unbridled ambition. It requires respect, observation, and alignment with principles that transcend time. As I studied these connections, I realized that many of the modern patterns of success and wealth weren't as new as we thought. Investment strategies, the organization of business empires, and even high-impact personal decisions reflect, often unconsciously, the principles I was discovering in ancient documents. It was as if the golden rule was present in every important decision, even when no one recognized it. This realization brought a new dimension to my investigation. Understanding the hidden law was also about understanding how we humans shape our own destiny through subtle and repeated choices. And then came an even deeper insight. It was not enough to simply study symbols, maps, and historical records. It was necessary to apply the law, to live it. Every step, every analysis, every correlation made between past and present was, in a sense, a test, a practice of the law itself. Those who tried to circumvent the ancient principles ended up losing more than gold. They lost opportunities, influence, and often their very stability. Understanding the law meant not only discovering, but also integrating and living its teachings, becoming part of a flow of knowledge that spans millennia. Thus, my journey began to shift direction. I was no longer just collecting information, but learning to grasp the essence of the Golden Rule, a system that goes beyond metal, beyond material wealth, and directly touches the way we live, make decisions, and perceive value in all its forms. And with each discovery, it became clearer that I was only beginning to unravel what had remained hidden for 2,000 years. As I progressed, I began to realize that the hidden law of gold wasn't limited to economic or historical concepts. It was deeply connected to our understanding of the human mind and how we interpret opportunities. It became clear that gold, as a metal, was merely a tangible representation of something much greater, the ability to perceive patterns, act strategically, and maintain balance between intention and action. Each clue I uncovered seemed to whisper that the true secret lay in the ability to observe the world with attention and discernment, recognizing the right moment to act and the right way to apply knowledge. Exploring ancient manuscripts and accounts, I realized that those who prospered throughout history shared common traits. They didn't just accumulate material wealth. They cultivated patience, long-term vision, and a deep understanding of the consequences of each choice. It was as if every action was connected to an invisible feedback loop, a silent law that rewarded discipline and insight, and punished impulsiveness and ignorance. I began to see that this logic was not just philosophical, but practical. Understanding it meant navigating cycles of prosperity and scarcity with much greater certainty. At the same time, I realized that the ancients deliberately protected this law. It wasn't just about hiding gold or documents. They constructed systems, codes, and symbols that required deep understanding to decipher. It was as if the law itself had a built-in testing mechanism. Only those who demonstrated their ability to grasp its principles could truly access its power. This realization made me reflect on how many modern opportunities operate in a similar way. Knowledge networks, strategic investments, and even high-impact personal decisions follow patterns that, without wisdom and discipline, can be wasted. And then I realized something even more revealing. The hidden law of gold manifests itself not only in tangible wealth, but also in the influence it exerts on people, ideas, and systems. Every decision made with clarity and awareness could alter not only my life, but also the environment around me, as if each action aligned with ancient principles magnified its effect in the real world. It was fascinating to realize that this law, though hidden for millennia, still operated, shaping the success and prosperity of those who knew how to recognize it. This discovery completely changed the way I viewed my journey. The search for physical gold became a quest for understanding, perceiving, and applying a logic that spanned centuries. Each new insight was not just a fragment of the past, but a key to interpreting the present and influencing the future. And the further I progressed, the more evident it became that true wealth, the one symbolized by gold, lies in understanding and living the principles of the occult law that humanity had lost 1,000 years ago. As I continued to follow the trail of the hidden law of gold, I realized that each historical discovery had a direct connection to seemingly simple human decisions. Small gestures, strategic choices, and disciplined attitudes seemed to follow an invisible pattern, as if there existed a silent logic that rewarded those capable of understanding its workings. It was striking to realize that the true essence of prosperity lay not simply in accumulating wealth, but in aligning action, intention, and knowledge with universal principles that span centuries. In an ancient scroll I found almost by chance, there were encoded instructions on the correct way to store and move gold. What caught my attention most were not the physical details, but the underlying philosophy. Every action should be done with full awareness, respecting natural cycles and human relationships. It was a form of teaching disguised as a practical technique, as if the ancients wanted any apprentice to understand that true wealth is the result of observation, discipline, and alignment with invisible forces. As I reflected on this, I began to see parallels with the modern world. Successful entrepreneurs, leaders, and visionaries apply similar principles, even without realizing it. Careful planning, risk analysis, opportunity perception, and strategic patience are contemporary reflections of what the Golden Rule taught millennia ago. It was fascinating to realize that this knowledge hasn't been completely lost. It has simply changed form, adapting to the times while maintaining its essence. Even more intriguing was how these lessons applied to areas beyond material wealth. Human relationships, personal decisions, and life plans followed similar patterns. Those who understood the logic behind actions and consequences were able to maintain balance and prosperity, while those who acted on impulse or greed were quickly penalized. It was as if the hidden law of gold were actually a universal law of alignment. Understanding and respecting invisible patterns brought lasting benefits, while ignoring them led to inevitable losses. And it was at this point that my journey took on a new dimension. I wasn't just unlocking ancient secrets. I was learning to apply these principles to my own life, testing them, interpreting them, and adjusting my actions as the knowledge unfolded. Each discovery was not just a lesson from the past, but a guide for the present, showing that true wealth, gold or otherwise, is always the fruit of perception, discipline, and connection with invisible principles that humanity has long forgotten. As I progressed, I began to realize that the hidden law of gold was not merely a set of rules or instructions. It was, above all, a reflection of the relationship between knowledge, action, and consequence. Each fragment discovered seemed to connect past and present, demonstrating that true prosperity never depends solely on luck or opportunity, but on the ability to interpret signs and act according to universal principles. And the more I understood, the clearer it became that those who mastered the law were capable of transforming not only their fortunes, but also the world around them. During my research, I found records of civilizations that applied these principles in an almost ritualistic manner. Every decision from resource allocation to choosing trading partners was made carefully, respecting standards that balance self-interest and collective harmony. It was fascinating to realize that this balance, often overlooked, was the key to preserving wealth and stability. I realized that gold itself was merely an instrument. The true law lay in understanding how to utilize resources and opportunities wisely. And then came the most important realization: the hidden law of gold required an active consciousness. It wasn't enough to know ancient techniques or coded symbols. It was necessary to internalize the principles and apply them consistently, almost as if each action were an expression of the law itself. This understanding revealed that lasting prosperity was not a consequence of external events, but of the alignment of perception, intention, and action. It was as if history itself taught me that to master gold, one must first master one's own mind and the way one interacts with the world. As I reflected on this, I realized that each previous discovery fit into a larger pattern. Maps, rituals, strategies of ancient empires, and even modern human behavior showed that the golden rule transcends time and culture. It was a silent, almost living force, guiding those capable of perceiving its rules, rewarding discipline, patience, and vision, and punishing impulsiveness and ignorance. And at that point, I began to feel I was on the verge of understanding the full essence of the secret that had remained hidden for over 2,000 years. Each step forward, each fragment deciphered, reinforced the conviction that this was not just an investigation into gold or material wealth. It was a journey to understand invisible patterns that shape destiny, prosperity, and even human consciousness. And, as I grasped this dimension, I felt I was about to reach a crucial point: the understanding that the hidden law of gold is not just history, but a living guide for those who dare to study it and apply it to their lives. As I neared the end of my investigative journey, I realized that all the fragments I had gathered, maps, symbols, rituals, behavioral records, and historical patterns together, formed a coherent web of knowledge. It was as if every civilization that knew gold had left clues, fragments of the same law, waiting for someone, centuries later, to discern its complete logic. And I finally understood that the hidden law of gold was not just about physical wealth, but about understanding how invisible forces shape destiny, opportunities, and even the very perception of value. What fascinated me most was how this law manifests itself both in the past and in the present. Those who master the ancient principles, consciously or unconsciously, can create prosperity not only by accumulating gold, but by understanding the flow of decisions, risks, and opportunities. Every action, every strategic choice, every careful interpretation of signals was, in practice, a living application of the law that for 2,000 years remained hidden. And the more I reflected on it, the clearer it became that this law demands constant attention. It rewards those who perceive patterns and act wisely, and challenges those who allow themselves to be carried away by haste or greed. By connecting all the clues, I understood that gold, as a metal, was merely a physical representation of something much greater: the human capacity to perceive, interpret, and apply universal principles. True wealth, I discovered, lies not simply in possessing resources, but in understanding the logic that governs their creation and preservation, and in applying this knowledge to all areas of life. It is a delicate balance between vision, discipline, and perception of the world, a silent force that spans cultures and millennia, guiding those capable of understanding it. And ultimately, I felt my journey wasn't just about unlocking ancient secrets, but about teaching, inspiring, and opening paths for those seeking true prosperity. Each discovery showed me that, although the law has been hidden for centuries, it is still within reach of those who dare to study, observe, and apply its principles with dedication. The hidden law of gold isn't just history. It's a living opportunity, waiting for those willing to go beyond the obvious, understand the invisible, and transform their perception of value, wealth, and destiny. After traversing centuries of history, analyzing symbols, rituals, and patterns of human behavior, I finally understood the essence of the hidden law of gold. It's not just a metal, wealth, or tangible fortune. It's an invisible principle that transcends time, cultures, and civilizations. It's a silent force that rewards discipline, patience, and strategic vision, and challenges those who ignore its signals. It's proof that true prosperity isn't the product of chance, but of a deep understanding of the laws that govern value and action. What struck me most was realizing that this law isn't lost forever. It remains alive, awaiting those who have the courage to study, observe, and apply its principles. Every choice we make, every opportunity we interpret, every decision made with care and wisdom is a modern manifestation of this ancient law. And this made me reflect, if humanity can rediscover these patterns, even without knowing it, how much more powerful can be those who decide to consciously study the law that has governed empires and shaped destinies for millennia. Now, more than ever, I understand that my role is not just to unlock the secret, but to share this journey. Every step I've taken, every clue I've deciphered, is an opportunity for you, who follow me, to realize that true wealth isn't just material wealth, but also knowledge, perception, and action aligned with universal principles. The hidden law of gold isn't just history. It's an invitation for each of us to transform our understanding of value and success. And that's exactly what I want to propose to you today. Look around you, observe patterns, learn to interpret signals, and apply principles that have stood the test of time. Try to realize that true prosperity lies in small, consistent, and conscious decisions that reflect respect for knowledge and time. If you're willing to follow this logic, the reward goes far beyond physical gold. It manifests in the form of clarity, control over your destiny, and the ability to transform opportunities into concrete results. If you feel ready to unravel the hidden law of gold and apply its principles to your life, join me on this journey. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to discover this secret, and subscribe to the channel to follow each discovery and insight that brings us ever closer to understanding how to truly prosper. The hidden law of gold exists, and now you have the chance to recognize it and make it part of your life.